Week 15 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at on the wire this week. The first guy, Michael Badgley of the Detroit Lions. So Michael Badgley, he's had a resurrection last season with the Indianapolis Colts. They didn't bring him back, and now he's over here with the Detroit Lions, and he's kicking the football pretty well as Michael Badgley. So the last few games here for Badgley: Week 11 at the Giants 6, Week 12 versus Buffalo 7, Week 13 versus the Jaguars 19, and Week 14 versus Minnesota 12. So Week 15, pretty decent matchup at the New York Jets that are bend but don't break type of defense here. So I think Badgley could get a few opportunities. I know the weather definitely could be bad over there in New York at MetLife Stadium, but he's a guy that's been cooking good football, and this Lion team's been playing at a high pace. Even though on the road, I think their offense is not going to be as good here, and that's just the nature as how it's been this season. But anyway, I think Badgley gets opportunities versus the Jets. Could have a decent 8-9 point fantasy day in Week 15, and he's available right now still 5% of fantasy leagues. The next guy I looked at on the wire this week here at the kicking positions, Riley Patterson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Riley Patterson, he's been a pretty decent kicker this season for this Jacksonville Jaguar team, and I know got a tough test versus the Dallas Cowboys here, that their defense clamps up a lot in the red zone here and keeps teams out of the end zone. That's exactly what they did in that ball game versus the Houston Texans. But the good thing here for Riley Patterson, the Cowboys do give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So Patterson right now available 98% of fantasy leagues. In the last few games here, he's been pretty decent. Week 12 versus the Ravens 6, Week 13 at Detroit 7, and Week 14 at Tennessee 13. So right now with a good matchup versus the Cowboys, and kicking the football pretty well over the last few weeks here is Patterson. He's a kicker I looked at this week. The next guy is Cameron Dicker of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Cameron Dicker, he's been on a good run over the last few weeks with Hopkins out and being the kicker for this Los Angeles Charger team. So the last few games here for Dicker, he's putting up the points. Week 11 versus Kansas City 9, Week 12 at Arizona 4, Week 13 at Vegas 8, and Week 14 versus the Miami Dolphins in that one, he had 10 fantasy points. So right now, tough matchup, I know, in Week 15 versus the Titans. I give up the second least amount of fantasy points to kickers on the season. But after coming off what we saw last week, getting the doors blown off by Jacksonville, I think Dicker could get a few opportunities. I think this Charger team at least will score 2 touchdowns in this one. And right now, he's still available in a decent amount of leagues, as well as Dicker in 52%. The next guy, Will Lutz of the New Orleans Saints. So Will Lutz, he's been a pretty solid kicker this season here. And right now, surprisingly, available in tons of fantasy leagues as Lutz at 92%. So the last few games for Lutz: Week 10 at Pittsburgh 5, Week 11 versus the Rams 9, Week 12 at San Francisco in that one. Unfortunately, they got shut out. He had the goose egg. And then Week 13, a good bounce back at Tampa with 8 fantasy points. And right here, Week 15, a good matchup for Will Lutz versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the 10th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And we could see a game of the kickers in that one where Lutz and Young Hoku, and the 5th and final kicker I looked at off the wire this week here is to mention Young Hoku of the Atlanta Falcons. So the Falcons, we know they're going to a quarterback change. Maybe this offense could be a little better and getting in the red zone a little bit more. But Young Hoku, he's out there in tons of fantasy leagues after being on the bye week here in 62% of fantasy leagues. In the last few games here for Koo, he's been money in the bank. Week 11 versus Chicago 12, Week 12 at Washington 9, and Week 13 versus Pittsburgh 13. So what a good matchup in Week 15 indoors at New Orleans, where they give up the 4th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. I like Koo as an ad and a guy who can help owners in the playoffs. So that's a few kickers I looked at on the waiver wire for Week 15 of the fantasy football season.